Welcome to Attribution Time. Today we have Howard Thompson. Howard, thanks for being on.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
Awesome. For those who are listening, Howard's got the UK accent, which is always going to make it more appealing for those who are listening in. But Howard is a brilliant man when it comes to data and analytics. I started following him on LinkedIn and some of his posts and his insights about data hygiene, how to use your data and optimize your data. And the company that he's a part of is called Fusion Analytics UK. And so obviously, I'm really looking forward to our conversation around marketing attribution and analytics. When we met, though, we jumped into the B2C side of it, whether the importance of kind of the evolution of B2C marketing attribution. Let's go ahead and jump into that.
Yeah, sure. So we work a lot with we do a little bit of B2B, but mainly with B2C. And it's really interesting because you've got a range of clients out there. We work across a load of sectors, so financial services, e-commerce, travel, and they all have a slightly different marketing mix. So some might be pure play digital, for example, but others often might mix them with sort of offline activity like direct mail, print ads, press ads, things like that. Specifically, you're trying to target older audiences. And then you've also got those brand players in there as well. So people are spending sort of above the line. So we do a lot of work in terms of trying to understand. You've got your typical attribution models, which when talked about normally focus on sort of like digital metrics and engagement with digital channels, but they don't always include these other factors, and we find it's often a missing layer. So we sort of taken the approach to, we built what we call our hierarchy of data decision needs. And this is a really simple pyramid to say, what do you need to do to make a decision of data? And the first layer is clean, consistent data to make sure that it's there. And often when we go into a client's place, they'll say, we've got digital data, we've got all of this data, but it's not always in the right format. So specifically, if you think about Google Analytics in the past, it's sort of like aggregated data, not linked to an individual and things like that, which means you then can't tie those offline journeys in. And then the next layer is context. So if you do a big brand campaign and see an uplift in results, it's sort of like having that in mind. And you've got a construct level, which is like the model. And that's really where questions around should you use attribution as part of that comes into play. And that's really where we sort of have our pyramid going up. And we say you need to sort of get all of these things and align them and then get a consensus or agreement around what all of that data means before you can project forward. So we go sort of a lot of different detail around that.
Yeah, it's a good call. I mean, to no surprise, you being in the data analytics side of things, there is a statistical mindset involved in that, right? So we got to think of outliers. And more often than not, when you get into marketing attribution and people like plug in a tool, they kind of forget about all the outliers, right? It's like, and it can really skew your data because you're just like, oh yeah, this campaign did great. And it's like, well, is it just one opportunity that made this campaign great, or is it truly like this campaign was as great as we think it is, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. We've got some really interesting outliers. We've got so we've seen before a furniture company, for example, where they had one person do over 1,000 visits to the website before buying.
Wow.
So we cross-stitched devices through our tracking, so we could see they used a desktop during the day, a laptop at night time, and a phone probably on their commute to work. But they went over 1,000 times, and what they were doing was using Google Shopping to search for different search terms, coming back into the site via a new session. So Google Shopping was saying, well, we've got all of this engagement which led to a sale, and then people are like, well, sorry, how can that happen? And then when you look at it at an individual level for outliers, you're like, okay, that's how it happens, which can be really interesting to see. We also seen for smaller brands, people often, you'll have like a phone line come through, and then an order happens, and someone basically just uses the main website to input all of those details.
Right.
So then that cookie is then responsible for, say, 100 orders that month, or however many orders they happen to be. And then when it comes to attribution, it's like all of those orders then get assigned to to all of the channels they've used, and normally those people are the same ones that have done a load of testing. So it's like every single channel we have shows they've got 1,000 orders, but I've only got 1,000 orders in my sales tin, and you're like, that's why. So it's quite interesting as well when you sort of like unpick of, well, why are there the outliers in there, and what can we do around that to stop that?
Yeah, that's one thing I really harp on this podcast is the importance of having someone who truly owns the attribution data. Now, obviously we're talking about B2C today, but even in the B2B world, like you have people that really own data, they own the data warehouse, and you have data engineers. But what I'm getting at is something even more minute in that you have the individual that really focuses on attribution to this exact point. Or you can go out and hire Howard and his team, right? It's like but you really need someone who owns that piece of data to understand the outliers, to understand those things, to understand everything that's happening there, because it's too hard to just do that on your own, like, or just like let something run in the background and then just start looking at dashboards like that. There's too much ambiguity in that, and I think that's just such a key point. So let me ask you though, so how do you go about that with teams? Like you get introduced to a team, it's a B2C client, and how do you start that? Do you just start with a questionnaire that the client fills out as far as data, like as you understand outliers? Do you meet and ask them these questions and try to like go a little, like try to peel the onion back? Like how do you go about discovering that data?
We don't have a huge outbound sales process. So what we tend to find is that we get referrals from MSPs largely. We try and as much as possible work with brands and things like that. But we often get referrals from MSPs, so that could be anyone from a software provider to an agency to whatever it happens to be. And normally they're stuck with a problem that they just don't understand. And often that comes back to the data being a problem. So we had one client that owned a very historical site of importance, which has over 400 retail units in London, for example. And they came to us and said, we've got infrared scans. We know that there's more people here in summer. We get all reports from the 400 stores in the area. We know that sales spike in summer, but when we put a geo net of phones over those areas, we don't get that same spike. And then when you don't get that same spike, that it knocks out everything, not just in terms of like, when I'm doing some media campaigns, do I see a result in an uplift? But it's also looking at sort of like every sort of report you want to get from there of like, what's the people, what's the profile of those people? How do I target more of those people? All of those questions go out the window. And in that case, we sort of, we came out with some basic rules, went back to the telephone provider and said, break everyone out into 4 segments. Tell me people who 3 days a week have been there between the hours of midnight and 5 a.m. Tell me the number of people 3 days a week been there between the hours of sort of like 10 and 4, and they live there and work there, and then the rest are visiting. And then as soon as you do that, suddenly you see the spike and it matches and it all tallies up. And it's that thing around understanding not just what the data is showing. I think with attribution as well, there's a big chat around the attribution will tell you, you've got all your different touch points, and it assigns a value to all those touch points, which is very much of like sort of like a share of what that person's done and what that channel's brought in and how much that's touched it. Doesn't necessarily talk about uplift. So there's also a lot of sides where people then start looking at sort of like, I need to test a channel. I've just done a load of Facebook spend, for example, and Facebook's telling me that it's driven this number of conversions, but then in my last click attribution model, my first click attribution model, it's sort of completely going away. What is happening? So often we start off with people normally come to us with a problem, and then we sort of start going through, solve that problem, and then work back more strategically. But we would love sort of more chats about sort of holistically how to solve some of these challenges.
Yeah, it's interesting with the difference between B2C and B2B and how you could even break down that data of visitors coming into a store, right? And the timing of those things. Now, as we all know in this world, B2C typically at some point will get back to B2B, and that maturity happens, right? But B2C is typically ahead of the curve in that. And I guess the way that would translate with B2B is the visits to the site, timing of the visit of the site, within the deal cycle, but also within the day. Like, when are they engaging with you the most to be able to target with them? How are they getting there within those targets? So it's really interesting hearing that from the B2C side of just breaking down store hours and visits and then being able to analyze the data from there. So this is a good pivot point to the maturity of attribution models. So, because what you just said, I think in my mind is more the progression of maturity within multi-touch attribution, being that, where to really hone in on channels, how to develop those channels, and how to measure that. And I think marketing attribution actually gets there at some point. It's a lot of data to consume when you plug it in and you're trying to do it all at once. There's a maturity involved in that. So, the example that comes to my mind is, when you first plug it in, and I can only speak from the B2B perspective, but when you first plug it in, you immediately see where you're spending all your money and where all the money's coming in, right? Like, that's the quickest analysis you can pull. And then you have to look at outliers and this and that. But that's the quickest cleanup typically, right? But to your point, it's not we're starting a new channel, we're starting a new effort. That's much later in the journey for B2B, right? That's a lot later. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the B2C side.
Yeah, so it's an interesting one of sort of like what are you going to use attribution for? So with if you go through, because we work quite closely with some teams, so we've got an insurer in Ireland, for example, working with quite heavily at the moment. And it's really interesting because they have, if you talk to all of their different teams, you're talking to their channel owners, they've got initiatives that they're going to be doing for next year. They're testing new things all the time, and they're working out incrementality. And a lot of the times they'll do incrementality tests on their own campaigns. They turn around and say, I mail this group an A/B test, and I can see that that's going to provide an uplift by changing the creative, putting a new journey in, or whatever it happens to be. Similar challenges within pay-per-click. You might do a postcode holdout, and then you'd look at the uplift in results of a strategy there, so that you know that it works. But then when you come to any centralized model, the question is does that always translate through? And the trouble is, because of some of the context around the channels and things like that, it doesn't always flow through as part of that. So you've got to ask yourself, well, what are you actually using the attribution framework for? And it gives you that really quick read, I think. So a lot of people say, well, actually, if I do this, I can get a quick read, and it means I can move and iterate. But then in terms of like planning forward, you then need to say, well, actually, maybe you turn around to all the people and say, we're going to try and, this is how we'll measure you use an attribution model, but you have to change these levers. And then we have to work around different ways of doing that. But we find that the attribution models themselves, they can't just work in isolation. It's got to be as part of what the team's going to use in terms of, and how they're going to use that as a measurement framework moving on.
Yeah, absolutely. And so before all that happens, you touched on this earlier on, is the data cleanup process.
Yeah.
How long does that typically take on the B2C side? Because, again, the B2B database is massive. You have accounts that are hundreds to thousands of people, and you touched a little bit on like some field cleanup, but what's that typical process usually within a B2C world of data hygiene, data cleanup prior to diving into attribution? What's expected there?
So it all depends on the clients. A load of people normally would have Google Analytics in place, but they're browsers. They're not people that you can identify and tie to other activity. So in terms of those three sort of like channel groups talked about before, about online, offline, and above the line, if you want to be able to build an attribution model, first of all, against all your channels that you can see, then the question is can you identify sort of those browsers that are coming to the site? Can you then tie that to the direct mail, or are there other ways in which you can do that as part of it? So obviously, if they can't do that, then that's a real blocker, and you've got to start afresh on the tracking, and you've got to build up a data set, and that could be a very long time. So it's really important that people implement the correct tracking first, and think through about how they do this. We found actually we ended up creating our own tracking software, which we implement alongside Google Analytics. And the reason we've done that is just that the applications for it at the end are massive, because you can then really cut into different cohorts and groups. And the GA4, the new GA4, which has been out, actually does that a lot as well by having more touch points in there, but it doesn't necessarily identify individuals. But you need the ability to really drill down at that sort of like specific customer level to look at those patterns. One of the things I'm really key on as well is looking at sequence of events. So not just trying to attribute to a channel, because I think a lot of people say, well, if you have an attribution model, some channels always come first and some always come second. You're never going to have a very good attribution model which uses CRM as a first quick touch point, because you need to have been there. So we often actually tie together sequence of events of things like retargeting, CRM, programs like that. But to do that, you have to have that granular level of data available. And often, most of the time we come in, we sort of see that that's not there. And we're having to do sort of a short-term gain in terms of trying to use what they have to come out with a result, but then whilst implementing a more longer-term strategy.
Do B2C companies understand the value or the importance of data? So, because when I hear you say that, I'm curious of how many B2C companies don't even have a data warehouse to host that data, right? Because then Fusion Analytics can come in and say, hey, we'll host it, we'll keep this, we have our, like, you can help them support that. But I mean, I don't know all the rules and regulations with UK. Obviously, they're more strict than the US, but I'm that's the first thing that comes to mind is like, is that the miss? Is the miss is just like, hey, we don't even have a place to host this data or store this data because we're not going to invest in XYZ data warehouse? Or is that in place and they don't know how to necessarily use it?
I think data. I think I suppose what I'm talking about really now is like data capture. So to ensure that you can tie that individual to a series, a customer journey of different touch points they've done at an individual level. So it's how we're doing all these touch points rather than an anonymous browser, because I think that enables you to do a little bit more in terms of like linking to coupon codes, in terms of linking to offline, because obviously that's really common in B2C.
Sure.
In terms of the data warehouse part, I would say, I mean, it all depends on the size and the scale of the businesses. But also a lot of people will have a data warehouse set up, but it's not necessarily being cleaned. They just sort of take a copy of data across, bang it in, and then it's not necessarily in a good structure. It's just in a single place for reporting. So then again, you sort of, whilst it's all in one area, it doesn't actually pull you much further forward, because it all needs categorizing, cleaning, structuring, updating, and all of those different things.
Yeah, that makes sense. I also like the idea that you mentioned with how did you phrase it? Compartmentalizing the data, right? Or a sequence of events is what you said.
Yeah.
I think that's really neat. So, but that makes me also think more of media mix modeling as opposed to multi-touch attribution. Media mix modeling does a good job of kind of sequencing of events, because then you can say, okay, what was the cause of this? Or you can ask a little bit more questions involved in that. So I'm curious that when you're working, or even when you say attribution in the B2C world, how much of that is multi-touch, which is, as we've kind of really touched on, is channel and the challenges of channel, and then how much of that is media mix modeling, and do you do a little bit of both, or what does that look like?
So in our solution, we would input basically all of the touch points that we can for an individual. So that would be online and offline. So they all go in as like one sequence of events, so everything you can see against that person. So it's like we sent a direct mail pack, and then they came back via search or something like that. So we load all of that into our tool. We also then overlay all of the things like TV spot time, so we can link those together. So you know, if you're familiar with TV spot time reports, but you can get quite cheap tools out there that says when I have a TV spot time, I see a spike in visits, but it doesn't often turn around and say, but this was how many orders were placed now, and this is how many orders they place moving further down. That's the uplift. So what we've done is to create a tool that captures all of the customer journeys, all of the different contextual data like TV spot times, like general campaign times, and then when you have a media mix model, normally it comes out with an answer like, when I spend this much on brand advertising, I get an uplift in this period.
Right.
And we can lace those into the model. We actually map all of that into an attribution model. So then we have,
Very
we
cool.
would take all of those touch points that you'd see in like a linear attribution model and then say, but on this touch point, I'm going to assign that to TV, and on this touch point or these touch points, I'm going to assign 20% of that effort to brand. So we actually find a way to sort of like merge those two together.
That's really cool. Yeah, y'all are doing some really, really neat things at Fusion Analytics. Howard, I appreciate you being on today. If anyone listening wants to follow Howard or learn more, I will put his link in the description below for LinkedIn. I've enjoyed following him and learning from him on there as well. But thanks for being on today.
No, thank you. It's been great to be here. Thank you very much.